Hello YouTube, Josh here with the channel ZZZ Giant Awake, and I'm responding to a video from a friend, Matt, and here goes nothing. So we are talking about subjective versus objective morality, which is obviously the most simple and intuitive conversation to ever have, right? No sorts of conflict has ever arisen from this subject. To kind of break down Matt's video and give you an introduction to it, his definition of morality was the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong and good and bad behavior. He asked the question, how do we determine good and bad behavior? And we agree that that part is at least a moving part. It is subjective. So what I consider to be moral is different than what somebody else considers to be moral, and there's no grand objective morality in that sense. But Matt offered some actual definitions, some suggestions for what morality could be. One of the definitions of what Matt offered to stand in as morally right and morally wrong, what he thought they could be and probably should be, is that what is morally right is actions and behaviors that promote health, happiness, and a flourishing society or hinders pain and suffering. And what is morally wrong is actions and behaviors that hinder health, happiness, and a flourishing society or leads to unnecessary pain and suffering. He said that these lines in the sand are not arbitrary. We see what works and what doesn't work in the real world. And then he suggested this starting point is something Matt Dillahunty said, which is that life is usually preferable to death, pleasurable to pain, and that we can build off of that. And he further affirmed that the actions in respect to the outcomes, even though subjectively what we plug in as morally can change, the outcomes, those actions and outcomes are objective, as in measurable and definitive. He didn't mention this, but something that we've talked about before is that pain is a real thing that happens in our brains, which is a physical thing that happens. And in that sense, that would prove that pain is a real thing, a real phenomenon. So I want to start by saying that I could be wrong on my perspective, that there's not any way to plug in anything as morality that would work like a maxim, and I'll define that later on. We may end up getting to the end of our conversation and Matt will have sufficiently demonstrated against my objections that there is something that we can call moral, and it would work as a definition functionally. And I want to say that the primary concern of this conversation is whether something can be plugged in and be functional. So I'm going to give a couple of objections, two specifically to the definitions that he gave, and then two more generally to maxims. The first objection that I have to your definition, Matt, is that it is too vague. How do I know what is right and wrong when many of several gray area situations arise? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm the head of the government and I have the opportunity to presumably successfully put in a smoking ban in place. I ban smoking. Smoking definitely causes harm to health, definitively, no questions asked. So it would seem to suggest that morally I should ban smoking. But this also would make smokers extremely unhappy, and by your definition, I shouldn't do anything that causes unnecessary happiness, such as banning cigarettes, which would then suggest that I shouldn't. But surely the health benefits weighed against the unhappiness would have to outweigh the unhappiness of the smokers, right? So should I? Let's even go to the example that you gave about the serial killer. You said that the serial killer stalks a family and he murders them for some pleasure, which in many definitions is a type of happiness. Even in that example that you gave, it seems like the killer might have some sort of defense because he got happiness out of it. And even though there was suffering that was unnecessary, he still got happiness from it. So maybe his happiness, which lasted longer than their suffering, should be what we take into consideration more. And if not, how do we decide what levels of suffering outweigh what levels of happiness, or vice versa? And this is the second objection that I have specifically to your definition, is that it seems to leave a lot of things that we would normally consider immoral as either amoral or potentially even moral. So let's say that I'm a poor person who cannot afford a TV. I have a foolproof plan for how to steal a television and get away from it, and I'm stealing it from Walmart. Now, let me consider the definition of morality that you have given me. My family of 5 would gain a lot of happiness from the stolen television. It would be a great pastime and would help us take off our minds from how poor we are. My plan, I want to re-emphasize this, is foolproof. I have no chance of really getting caught or punished for stealing that television. Therefore, there's no risk involved. The happiness of the shareholders would seem to be not affected at all. Surely one missing television set from a Walmart won't affect the stock prices of Walmart overall. Therefore, it is not only morally justifiable under your definition that I could steal a television set, but it would seem like I'd be morally obliged to, because I would be providing happiness with no risk of unhappiness and really no unhappiness to be had by the stockholders. Let's get to the more broad sense of the problem of trying to come up with maxims to deal with morality. Now, to define the term maxim, it is a dictate or series of dictates that is meant to encapsulate what actions should be taken and calling those actions moral, or actions that should be avoided and calling those actions immoral. Now, there are 2 big objections that I seem to keep on running into with myself when I run into moral philosophy and maxims. And the first one can be summarized in a question. I would prefer not to be, while causing no serious harm to others, why should I be moral? And this is not just an applicable question to Matt's definitions, but to any maxim philosophy of morality that I have ever come into. Let's just go back to the example that I gave earlier about the smokers and me being in charge of the government. Now, we're not considering questions of whether what I could do is against somebody's rights, or whether I would be successful or not. We're setting those questions aside, and let us assume that we have indeed done the research to find that it is the moral choice to ban smoking. But now we come into the question, but what if I don't want to hear smokers complain about my decision to take away their smoking? What if I just don't want to deal with the pushback that I'll get from that? Why, under those circumstances, should I choose to ban smoking? What is my motivation for being moral? Now, I'm certain that there are thousands of examples that someone could come up with, like, why should I go to the doctor when I don't think I have any issues and don't feel like it, even though it could improve my health? Why should I try 100% at work when it contributes to a flourishing society when I don't feel like it? Why should I spend time volunteering to help with children when I have other things that I feel like I'd rather be doing, such as consuming media or playing poker or any other number of hobbies that I could have? Now, my second objection to maxims is that they seem to have this issue where they have to be open to interpretation, to the interpretation of the person who's trying to act morally. Otherwise, they seem to be too rigid to function the way that they were intended, or they have to have exceptions or exemptions. A good example of something that I could make up as a maxim is do your best while not harming others. That is sufficiently broad enough to cover me doing what I think is morally right. Well, as long as I don't harm others, it makes it hard to call it morally wrong. And the problem with it, which is kind of the problem I was getting at earlier with the example that I gave to Matt, is that it has to be open to interpretation to be broad enough to be functional at all. So I could say helping my mom is something that's morally right. I mean, are there any things that you could think of that would fall outside of what's immoral or moral in doing your best while not harming others? The other side of the scale is like commands, which are like, thou shalt not kill. But what if someone's trying to kill me or a loved one, or my life might be at risk because someone's breaking into my house? I mean, at what point does it become an amoral or a moral issue? Now, I do want to commend Matt for starting the series off and trying to take on this undertaking because it has baffled many philosophers, and only the bad ones seem to think that they have an answer to what a maxim for morality is, and I'm glad that he's exploring it. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Matt, for starting off this video series, and I look forward to your response. Adieu.